Oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. The province's $15 million contract with Medivy Health Services to produce our Nova Scotia health cards expired 6 months ago. These cards are now being administered on a month-to-month basis, Mr. Speaker. Imagine that. These are the cards that all Nova Scotians use when they interact with our publicly funded universal health care system. My question is, what is the current status of the contract to administer these vital health cards?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the Minister of Health to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. That contract is currently being reviewed for an RFP process, Mr. Speaker, so we're bringing together the information we need. Of course, it's a very important part of our healthcare system is the MSI system. It's imperative that we get the terms of reference for our RFP lined up appropriately, so that due diligence is underway now.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, now Nova Scotians can see why our healthcare system is in such disarray under this government. The fact is the contract was a multi-year contract. It expired 6 months ago, and now, 6 months later, while it's on a month-to-month basis, the minister's thinking about maybe doing an RFP, Mr. Speaker. No wonder this contract is symbolic of the way this government runs our healthcare system, which is clearly on a month-to-month basis. So I would like to ask the Premier, why did his government fail to secure a long-term contract to provide Nova Scotians with health cards within the time allowed?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for his question. I want to thank the Minister of Health for the tremendous work he's doing across this province. I'm very proud of the work that this government has done in tearing down 9 district health authorities, Mr. Speaker, to a single health authority. The most recent budget that they voted against, there's funding to build 70 collaborative care centres across the province so that Nova Scotians have access to primary health care. Today it was announced that the Department of Immigration is travelling with the health authority to the UK to attract family physicians into this province, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to address the issues facing Nova Scotians and we'll continue to do so, Mr. Speaker, and lead this province forward.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
All of that is just talk if Nova Scotians can't even count on this government to get the fundamentals of the administration of our health ID cards right, Mr. Speaker. That is the way every single one of us interacts with the healthcare system when we go to a doctor, when we go to the hospital. Everyone else in the history of healthcare has managed to keep those cards moving, Mr. Speaker, but not this government. No wonder people don't trust them anymore to find them a family doctor, Mr. Speaker, or to keep their emergency rooms open when they can't even get the fundamentals of the health card right, Mr. Speaker. So I will ask the Premier to tell the House when they will have a long-term plan for the provision and administration of our health care ID cards.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians today, tomorrow, and every day forward will continue to have access to their health ID cards. The Honourable Member is referring to, Mr. Speaker. He's very right. Our government has done things differently than other governments, Mr. Speaker. They've continued to roll, successive government after government continue to roll over and spend money in collective bargaining process as opposed to spending it in frontline care for Nova Scotia. And we're going to continue to spend in frontline care.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. I'd like to direct a question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker. Across the country, we're seeing a wave of dramatically rising minimum wages in BC, in Ontario, and in Alberta, all moving towards $15. And there's mounting evidence of the benefits that a significant increase in the minimum wage of this sort can bring both for employees as well as for the economy in general. In 2013, when the Liberals took power, Nova Scotia had one of the highest minimum wages in Canada. On October 1st, 2017, we became the province with the lowest minimum wage in our country. Mr. Speaker, we have one of the highest paid premiers in Canada. And this Premier is leading a province which has the lowest wage for low-paid workers. Does the Premier see anything wrong with that?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to remind him, Mr. Speaker, we just passed the budget, the largest single tax cut in the history of the province, Mr. Speaker, that actually ends up going into Mr. Speaker, directly to low-income Nova Scotians, the impact. We've seen the single largest increase in income assistance in this province's history under our government, Mr. Speaker. For those vulnerable Nova Scotia require our support. The honourable member yesterday was talking about rent in this province, Mr. Speaker. We've increased rent supplements that have reduced the wait list for affordable housing, Mr. Speaker, by over 20%, and we're continuing to decline. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to move forward and make sure that those Nova Scotians who require our support and help will get it.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his first supplementary.
Thank you. It's 130,000 people in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. That's just short of a third of all the working population of the province who are making less than $15 an hour. The Premier speaks about the tax changes in the budget just passed, but the fact is that these changes to the basic personal allowance will put around $160 a year back in people's pockets, while increasing the minimum wage to $15 would give low-wage workers an additional $7,500 a year. I'd like to ask the Premier, wouldn't people living close to the line be better off with $7,500 extra dollars rather than just $160?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, all Nova Scotians were better off the day that they voted the NDP out of power, Mr. Speaker. For 4.5 years, Mr. Speaker, when they had an opportunity to impact the lives of Nova Scotians, they were paralyzed by the opportunity that was given to them to Nova Scotians. Let me remind the honourable member the single largest increase in income assistance happened under this government, but while that government stayed paralyzed with the opportunity. We reduced the affordable housing wait list, Mr. Speaker, while they were paralyzed by the opportunity, Mr. Speaker. We reduced taxes for the most vulnerable citizens in this province while they were paralyzed. Oh no, they weren't, Mr. Speaker. They increased it, Mr. Speaker. We reduced it.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have not asked the Premier for his assessment of the government that was elected a decade ago. And I have not...
Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Nor, Mr. Speaker, have I asked the Premier for his assessment of things that I may or may not have supported in the course of my lifetime. I have, however, asked him, does he think it fair and reasonable before the people of Nova Scotia that we have the third highest paid Premier in the country while our minimum wage workers have the lowest minimum wage in all of Canada?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I didn't have to answer the question on that. Government Nova Scotians already did.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the 2012 to 2022 Physician Resource Plan indicates that we need 50 new doctors a year just to replace the retiring doctors, Mr. Speaker. In other words, just to stand still. The 2016 update to that plan says that this government has already fallen behind on its 50 recruitments a year by 85 in the first 4 years of that 10-year plan. In other words, Mr. Speaker, of the 200 doctors that we needed just to stand still, this government is already short by 85. So I would like to ask the Premier, why has his government fallen so far behind in the recruitment of replacement doctors?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As we know, I've said this many times in this House, we added an additional 10 resident seats at Dow Medical School, Mr. Speaker, for Canadian-trained physicians. There's another 10 resident seats for international competency tests. That will increase the number of resident seats in our province to 56. He's very right, 50 is the requirement. On top of that, there's an additional 50 seats for specialists, 15 of which will be dedicated to 15 addition resident seats, 5 of which will be dedicated to Cape Breton Island, Mr. Speaker. It's a long-term vision on how we continue to provide a stable environment to continue to make sure that they have resources required. There's no question, Mr. Speaker, that this has been an ongoing challenge for decades. The structural changes will take time. I also said it earlier in an answer, the Minister of Immigration is joining the Health Authority to go to a recruitment drive in the UK. I'm looking forward to the results of that, and looking forward to continuing to work with our primary healthcare caregivers across this province so that Nova Scotians have access to a healthcare provider.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this is the Premier that promised every Nova Scotian a family doctor. Now we have 100,000 people looking desperately for a doctor, Mr. Speaker. The government's already 85 behind. Mr. Speaker, 50 new ones every year just to break even and make up for retirements. The Premier says that he's going to provide 10 doctors through the budget and another 10 sometime in the future. Mr. Speaker, that is not good enough when 100,000 people today are without a family doctor and they're behind just on replacement doctors. The Premier says there is a long-term plan. I want to ask him directly, just how long-term does he expect those 100,000 Nova Scotians without a doctor to wait until he finally gets the message that they need help?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As he knows, it's been an ongoing challenge for successive governments, Mr. Speaker, to continue to make sure that we have the replacement of the healthcare providers across the province. He would also know that practices are changing to require more healthcare professionals. That's why we've introduced the 70 collaborative care centres that are in this current budget over the next 4 years, to continue to make sure that we have primary healthcare teams across the province, which will have a physician, nurse practitioners, family practice nurses. In my view, Mr. Speaker, in some of those communities that require a social worker to look at determinants of health, all of those things will be part of how we deal with the ever-changing dynamic of delivering care and the ever-changing demand by residents when it comes to accessing that care.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, there are serious concerns about whether this government's attempt at redrafting the Incompetent Persons Act is constitutionally sound. On Monday, the Minister of Justice tried to allay some of these concerns by telling reporters, quote, "We've reached out to the legal community and the academics, even those who are critical of the bill and that it hasn't gone far enough, believe it's constitutional," unquote. However, following a media request for a list of who was consulted, the Minister admitted that no one has directly advised that it follows the Constitution. So I asked the Minister, why would he give such conflicting statements about the constitutionality of this important piece of legislation?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. The discussions that I shared on Monday was around the collective discussions, Mr. Speaker, of those we reached out to externally as well as internally within the Department of Justice. We believe, based on those collective discussions, that this bill is constitutional. When I spoke yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I tried to clarify that it was the collective discussions of all the people we've engaged through the consultation process that we believe makes this bill, this bill is constitutional.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, an expert in mental disability law from Dalhousie University Law School did provide feedback to the government on the proposed approach twice. He argued that allowing the survival of orders made under the previous legislation is, and I quote, completely illogical, given the unacceptable standards of the old Act. Furthermore, he argues that it leaves a significant number of vulnerable individuals subject to all of the vulnerabilities or abuse permitted under the former legislation with no mandatory scrutiny, which suggests an abandonment of responsibility. So I ask the Minister, how can a piece of legislation be constitutional if it grandfathers in a key element of previous legislation that has been deemed unconstitutional?
I'm going to rule that question out of order. We're asking the minister's legal opinion on a piece of legislation, and that's not allowed. So. The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. A constituent of mine, a young woman named Holly Ched, was recently ordered to have diagnostic breast screening due to lumps found in both of her breasts. It took Ms. Ched more than 3 weeks to receive a referral from a nurse practitioner, and then she was told she must travel to Yarmouth for the tests. Sadly, she was just informed that the radiologist has quit, and now her already long wait has turned into February. We hear that more than 50 other women have had their appointments rescheduled. My question is, how does the Minister justify the stress and health risks that go along with the lack of access to cancer testing?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Indeed, just this morning, myself and actually members from across all three parties had the opportunity to meet with representatives of the Canadian Cancer Society operating here in the province, and they talked a little bit about what cancer services. They highlighted, in fact, Mr. Speaker, that they're supportive of the approach to cancer care in the province of Nova Scotia as part of their opening remarks in terms of the specific specific situations, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the staffing availability for a particular service, Mr. Speaker, if the member wants to have a bit more conversation on that specific case, certainly happy to look into it with her.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, these extremely long waits just adds even more stress to those women who are already worried and anxious about their health. The average wait for diagnostic breast screening is as low as 33 days. In some other areas, the wait is as low as 11 days. But for these women, they are being told they will have to wait more than 120 days. Holly is willing to travel to another hospital, but was told she cannot. My question to the minister is, considering we have a provincial health authority, will the minister take immediate steps to fix the rigid health care policies that prevent common sense to prevail when it comes to cancer screening, and when will a new mammogram radiologist be hired?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, I thank the member for the question. As I mentioned, the particular in this case, if the member has, as it seems, additional information or details about that situation, I believe in this question, identifying that they were looking for the opportunity or willingness to go to another part of the province. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, that's one of the advantages and the design intentions of the one provincial health authority with the Nova Scotia Health Authority. As I'd mentioned in the previous question, if the member has additional details, let's connect, again, recognizing the privacy of the individuals involved, and we'll take a look at that and follow up accordingly.
The Honourable Member for Pictou, Argyll-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I mean, if he wants to go, there you go. Over the past number of years, we've noticed that this government has made increasing use of FlexTrack as a means to awarding government contract work. Indeed, it appears that in 2016-2017, Nova Scotia awarded almost $11 million through FlexTracks. So my question to the Minister of Internal Services, could the Minister explain what is FlexTrack and why is it so popular with this government?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. Our procurement procedures are very in-depth, very thorough. We follow procurement law to the letter. In terms of FlexTrack, if that service is the most appropriate and gone through the vetting process, that is in terms why contracts are awarded to them or through them. For details, I mean, we do have a very strict policy of being as open and transparent as possible, and all of our RFPs and awards are posted, and I'd be happy to answer further or look into it further for the minister if there's any specifics.
The Honourable Member for Argyll-Barrington.
All right, so thank you very much. So public accounts today, it showed that contracts awarded through FlexTracks appear in public accounts documentation as one lump sum payment to FlexTrack, which is to say, Mr. Speaker, that departments are not disclosing who they're actually working with. The current FlexTracks reporting protocols allows government to funnel money to suppliers while keeping the names of those suppliers from public scrutiny. So my question to the minister, will the minister commit today to lifting the shroud of secrecy around FlexTracks and begin accurately reporting to who they're giving money to?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question again. I'd be more than willing to look into that further and get back to the member.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is also for the Minister of Internal Services. In public accounts earlier today, we learned that Internal Services ran a tender process for a portion of its help desk application that they knew only one company, Sierra Systems, could possibly win. This initial tender has now been amended and amended and amended to allow for additional products and services entirely at the department's discretion. The RFP originally awarded was at $3.8 million. It's already up to $7.3 million, Mr. Speaker. It's almost doubled. An objective observer might say that the department is using an open-ended tender to essentially give Sierra Systems a blank check. My question for the minister is, can the minister tell us what controls are in place to keep this contract from going further afield than it already has?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for the question. In terms of risk assessments, particularly with this software, which is a service-based software, we recognized the risk, we debated the risk, and any services from government or from NSHA, anyone who is going to be impacted by this service, were completely involved in the risk assessment, which we have records for, and I'd be willing to provide for the member.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The department issued an RFP for $3.8 million. The cost is already up to $7.3. Could go as high as 11. We heard this morning. I don't know about the risk assessment around that process. And I would ask another question. The department said they expect this application to be in place for 15 to 20 years. And unfortunately, the underlying system is run on Adobe Flash, and Adobe just announced that in 2020 it will no longer support Flash. That's just 3 years away, Mr. Speaker. What we learned today is the department basically said, when we asked them, they said, well, that's the application supplier's problem. In fact, it's not, Mr. Speaker. It's our problem. We got $7+ million invested in this, maybe more. How can the minister stand behind an open-ended contract when the minister can't say what the application will look like just 3 years from now?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd love to be able to know exactly what applications are going to look like for the next 3-4 years. But in all fairness, I'd like to applaud our department, because our department is constantly...
Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
I'd like to thank the member for his question. I'd like to answer in terms that our department is constantly looking at innovative ways to stay on top of the technology curve and to make sure that we are protected and that we are well serviced and that we stay within our means. Our department is constantly looking at new innovative ways to move us forward, and we take into consideration the eradication of technology and the development of new technologies.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When introducing a cap-and-trade program, the government had to expect, surely, at the very least, a few basic questions would be asked. For instance, who would participate? What are the emissions reduction targets? What will the emissions cap be for participants, and how will this impact consumers? Yet, Mr. Speaker, it's become very clear over the past few weeks that the Minister of Environment can't seem to answer even these basic questions. So I'd like to ask the Minister here, how does he expect us to support a program and a bill that we know so little about?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This cap-and-trade program is about listening to Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Through consultation, we've heard from Nova Scotians that they want to continue to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but they also want to grow the economy in a sustainable way as we transition to a low-carbon economy, Mr. Speaker. We have regulations that are coming up, and we look forward to those discussions with Nova Scotians as we set our targets for the cap-and-trade program. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, one thing we've learned about this cap-and-trade program is that actually private companies who are big polluters may even be able to earn a profit by selling unused emission credits. So here we have a program that will potentially subsidize large corporations like Nova Scotia Power, for instance, and at the very least, shouldn't this money be placed in the green fund so it can be used to help those Nova Scotians that the minister says he cares so much about, in order for low-income people in particular to transition to a low-carbon economy? So my question for the minister is this: will he commit today to ensure that any monies that are flowing from the sale of emissions credits from these big polluters are diverted to the green fund to help the greening of all Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
As I said before in the House, any funds that come through the cap and trade program are going into the Green Fund, not the General Revenue Fund. It will be targeted at climate change initiatives. Mr. Speaker, the cap and trade system, again, is designed for the lowest cost. That's why it's a market-based system. It'll achieve greenhouse gas reductions in the lowest cost possible. Mr. Speaker, there are allowances that we're beginning to in order for our businesses to transition. This is how other cap and trade systems are created across the world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In today's Chronicle Herald, a parent of a middle school student shared a troubling story from Guysborough County, and I'll table that article. Her daughter was called to the office and was told that because her parents had not yet paid her school fees, she would not be permitted to attend the first school dance of the year, happening that night. The mother stated, "It's past time for the grown-ups to take care of money matters and give the kids the education they deserve without constantly putting the hammer down on students to produce money, like some shady B-movie loan shark." My question is for the Minister of Education. Does the Minister agree with the decision of preventing students from taking part in school activities if their families have not paid the school dues?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Of course not, Mr. Speaker. I don't agree with that. And in fact, we have a policy in place regarding student fees, which I'll table for the member, where it states very specifically that students should not be made to feel awkward or pressured because of these situations, and there is flexibility within that policy for principals to work out arrangements with families that can't afford to pay those fees, which are directly related to field trips, dances, and extracurricular activities as such. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also have that document as well, and I'm happy to table that as well. Will the minister now take action and ensure that this policy is being enforced?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we acted yesterday when we saw the article in the Herald, and our staff reached out directly to the board to ensure that the policies of the province were properly being followed, and we wait to hear what they have to say about that. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. Residents of Halifax are expressing fresh concerns over the increased noise in their neighbourhoods. A growing number of vehicles have been equipped with those aftermarket loud mufflers. Under the Motor Vehicle Act, law enforcement has limited ability to conduct mobile testing for vehicle decibel levels and would constitute a public nuisance. Halifax Council recently voted unanimously to ask the province to reform the Act, including the use of mobile devices, to issue tickets under the Act for stronger controls on noisy mufflers, and I'll table that. My question, Mr. Speaker, is how does the Minister intend to respond to the City of Halifax and those concerned with increasing levels of vehicle noise?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we will rely on the fabulous relationship we have with HRM across the bridge that we have with regard to transportation. We take that seriously. That, of course, would involve, I believe, an ability for them to pass a bylaw to do that, which would involve processes with the Department of Municipal Affairs. But like any concern that comes from any of our municipal partners, we will look at it seriously. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yes, thank you again, Mr. Speaker. I guess a fabulous relationship may be on, depending on who you ask. Some of the street noise that concerns residents is winding down as the cold weather arrives, but that doesn't mean that we should be ignoring this. Spring will be around the corner soon, and we need prompt action in order to allow law enforcement. Mr. Speaker, will the department commit today to reviewing concerns about vehicle noise, and will they move forward with legislation to address these concerns under the Motor Vehicle Act by the spring?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we have decibel levels that are used universally across the province with regard to noise, especially coming from highways, and we take mitigation efforts where they're required, depending on whether or not it is because of a recent activity that the department has undertaken in terms of creating a new road, or if it is a situation where the development has grown up around the highway, which is often the case because we know that highways are economic generators, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For a couple of years now, the residents of Cole Harbour Eastern Passage constituency have been wondering what's going to happen to the opportunities in all of their communities, pending whether Cole Harbour or Auburn High School are going to be closed. And we're still waiting for that review. But it impacts the new Island View High School in Eastern Passage. I had an opportunity to speak with the superintendent of schools on Monday and asked him point blank, is there going to be an IB program and the skills trades available at this new high school? And the answer was no. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is to the Minister of Education. Can the Minister tell me what I should be telling the parents of Eastern Passage, Shearwater area, what's going to happen to their students who want to participate in those programs when they're no longer going to be available?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the member will know, those are operational decisions that are made at the board level. We are in the process of reviewing that administrative model with the idea of ensuring that there is consistency across the board in terms of application of policy and opportunities. And this is an important question for Dr. Avis Glaze to consider. Absolutely. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
So, Mr. Speaker, I just want to be very clear when I get the phone calls after tonight. Is the minister saying that he's going to try to ensure that those programs are offered, or that he's going to find a way for the students to participate in those programs at another school? Thank you, Mr.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
So what we're doing is reviewing the administrative model of the education system, Mr. Speaker. Currently, those decisions are under the jurisdiction of our boards. However, we do want to ensure that there is consistency in terms of opportunities for our kids from one classroom to the next, from one region to the next. And this is an important topic for consideration for our world-renowned expert in the field of education and administrative models, Mr. Speaker, and we'll make sure that she gives this question full consideration. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, the Dartmouth General Hospital serves 120,000 people, covering Dartmouth and stretching down the eastern shore. When someone in mental health crisis presents at the emergency department of the Dartmouth General, they are not able to access mental health clinicians at that site. If a patient needs to be admitted, staff have to call Halifax to see if one of the 3 beds are available. Mr. Speaker, does the minister think it is reasonable that people in Dartmouth do not have access to emergency mental health services in their hospital?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for raising this important issue. Of course, as I've mentioned before, I think all members of this legislature, indeed all Nova Scotians, recognize the importance of mental health of our citizens. We all would have family members, friends that may find themselves, and indeed even ourselves from time to time, Mr. Speaker, may require these types of services. That's why I'm pleased that in the budget that we've been debating the last several weeks, Mr. Speaker, sees significant investments going towards enhancing mental health support services across the province. Indeed, there are access to crisis supports, Mr. Speaker, when individuals in Dartmouth and indeed across the province are in need. And those services are available, Mr. Speaker, throughout the province. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, I look forward to hearing more about that and find out if there are going to be mental health services available at Dartmouth General. But my next question is about access to primary health care. So we know that primary health care is critical for people with ongoing health issues. This is particularly true for individuals with mental health concerns. People need access to a family doctor to monitor their condition, prescribe appropriate medication, and to ensure a treatment plan is working. There are thousands of Dartmouth residents without access to a family doctor and thousands more who have doctors that are soon to retire. Mr. Speaker, will the minister tell people in Dartmouth how much longer they have to wait for access to primary care?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Again, particularly to those around the mental health support services. With the investments outlined in our budget, Mr. Speaker, we'll see over 70 mental health clinicians hired to spread out across the province to increase access throughout communities. Indeed, depending on the nature of the mental health challenges that one is dealing with or working through, Mr. Speaker, there's a variety of clinical expertise to be be provided. Not all of those services are provided or need to be provided by physicians. And so again, we're taking very seriously our commitment and the needs of the people of Nova Scotia to receive those supports, particularly in the mental health space, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Justice. More than a year ago, the court struck down Nova Scotia's Incompetent Persons Act, calling sections of it unconstitutional. The court gave the government until this December 17th of this year to pass and proclaim new legislation that will be constitutional. So my question is, what steps has the minister and his department taken in the process to ensure Nova Scotians it is constitutional?
We'll allow the question because you are asking what steps have been taken, not what advice. So the Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. We have undertaken, Mr. Speaker, a consultation process that includes those internal and external of government. There has been a tremendous amount of work go into that. The opinions and views of many have been gathered. And based on the collective information that we have, Mr. Speaker, and the lens of those professionals, both in the academic and legal community, we believe the bill is constitutional.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday in law amendments, there were many percenters who indicated that it is unconstitutional. And yesterday, and I will table this, the minister told reporters that verbatim, trying to portray that through the consultation process and having engaged all of those players, we came to a collective decision that the bill was constitutional. Will the minister commit today to take the proper steps that should have been taken a year ago to make sure the bill withstands a constitutional challenge, which I believe will happen?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is, in fact, Mr. Speaker, the role of the legal professionals is to review any bill that comes before the House to determine its constitutionality. In these circumstances, based on the collective work that we've done, we believe the bill is constitutional.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of EMO. Mr. Speaker, earlier today I tabled a petition from the residents of Victoria County and area asking the government to ensure that cellular antennas and towers be installed to improve areas of poor communication throughout Victoria County. This situation became even more crucial over the summer when residents of the St. Anne's North River area lost their landlines for days due to road construction and had to travel for 15 to 20 kilometres just to be able to use their cell phones. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, does the Minister feel that this situation is acceptable in today's times?
The Honourable Minister responsible for Emergency Measures Organization.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for the question. This has come up a number of times in our discussions in this session, and we're always monitoring the situation across Nova Scotia. We have a very strong relationship with our municipal partners who all design municipal plans as per the Emergency Measures Act. If there's a specific situation that the member has, we'd be more than happy to hear about it. CRTC controls the regulations in regards to phone lines, but in saying that, we're always interested in hearing these stories, and we do whatever we can to build strong relationships and partnerships with the private sector to address some of the concerns that come from residents.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, many of these underserviced areas have seniors, some of whom require lifeline services. And because of this unpredictability of their landline service and no cell phone coverage, all the residents would be unable to contact emergency services such as EHS, the fire departments, or even the police. and time could be very precious. Will the Minister commit to working to ensure that cellular antennas, towers are installed to improve areas of poor communications throughout Victoria County?
The Honourable Minister responsible for the Emergency Measures Organization.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I'd like to thank the member for the question, and I'd like to recognize the work that our government is trying to do to enhance connectivity across the province. As I've said before, municipalities are the first line of defence when it comes to any kind of emergency situation. In the situation with Richmond County, our staff actually reached out to Richmond County to receive more information on the situation that the member from Cape Breton Richmond was dealing with her constituents. I'll make the same offer to the member opposite to have EMO reach out to Victoria County representatives to continue the conversation and get some more information.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Palliative care is an important part of our healthcare system. The Cumberland County Hospice and Palliative Care Society have been aspiring to build a residential hospice facility for several years. A generous citizen has donated several acres of land, and our community are committed to raising the funds for the physical structure. Large donors want a commitment first from the Department of Health that they approve of the operational plan. My question to the Minister of Health is, will the Minister meet with the Cumberland Hospice Society and have staff work with them to approve their operational plan so that construction can begin?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Indeed, we're seeing more and more interest in palliative and hospice type services from one end of the province to the other. Her community is no exception, Mr. Speaker, and I think that's fantastic, recognizing the services for all Nova Scotians. That's why I want to commend the work of my predecessor, the current Minister of Community Culture and Heritage, for having established and spent a considerable amount of time in the Department of Health and Wellness to establish a hospice framework, Mr. Speaker, to have guidelines. So indeed, if the member wants to encourage her community or that organization to reach out to the Department of Health, we'll make sure they get in touch with the appropriate group within the department to begin those conversations.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for your answer. As health critic, I've received concerns throughout the province around palliative care issues. For example, in Cape Breton Richmond, there's a physician who has a palliative care physician who's decided to retire at the end of this year because the NSHA in that area is not willing to work with him and incorporate his work into the palliative care strategy. Also, I've received concerns from the Hospice Society of Victoria County, where our member Victoria from the Lakes is from, that they have inadequate funding to meet the palliative care demands of their area. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Health is, will the Minister make a commitment to meet with this physician and the Hospice Society of Victoria to better understand the palliative care needs of those areas?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member's question. As I'd mentioned previously, indeed, the interest and the demands or interest and desire to receive and expand our palliative and hospice services across the province is important, and we do have a framework in place now, Mr. Speaker, which was not previously in place, so that was work that was done the last couple of years. That's a framework to ensure that we have a model available for all Nova Scotians. It's fair across the province, the same model being same approach being taken. I think it's also important to recognize that there has been work indeed in Nova Scotia with other healthcare professionals like paramedics who are able to provide palliative type services as well. So there are a lot of creative and work being done here, and innovative work in Nova Scotia in the space of palliative hospice care for all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, last week in a question to the Minister of Immigration, I noted that international students are not eligible for MSI until they have been in the province for 13 months. I asked the Minister if she had any plans to improve upon the situation, given that the Government of New Brunswick recently announced they will provide MSI coverage for all international students, their spouses and dependents throughout their degree program. However, the Minister avoided the question by repeating general talking points. So I ask her again, does the Minister have any plans to improve MSI coverage for international students and their families?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Want
want everyone to know that immigration and particularly international students are a priority for us at Nova Scotia Office of Immigration, and our government has made it a focus, and we are doing incredible progress. Just to let you know, I have met with Student Nova Scotia. They brought in a number of issues related to immigration, and I'm happy to say over the last 2 years we have build a number of pathways to allow them to stay here once they graduate. We've also done a program that is recognized in Nova Scotia as a leader all over the world, because it does not exist anywhere, and that is they are able to open up businesses here.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Immigration talks about attracting and supporting international students as a priority for long-term immigration for Nova Scotia. And she references this pathway, the International Graduate Entrepreneur Stream. However, the office's own website shows that only 4 international students have thus far been invited to apply. So I asked the Minister to explain the dismal results of the International Graduate Entrepreneur Stream.
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. For the record, we have made incredible progress. We have nominated over 500 international students in 2016 alone. That compared to 100 in 2013. In terms of the international graduate stream, that only came on board a year ago, and it takes 12 months before anybody is able to graduate. And in fact, after they graduate, in order to open up a business, and part of the condition is they have to be in operation for at least 12 months and then provide us proof of that. So the first person that actually was nominated was in April 2017, and we are excited about that. So there's a lot of work that has been done on that. It's true. No, it's true. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we got 2 physiotherapists over here, Mr. Speaker, when they hurt their shoulders from patting themselves on the back so well over there. Mr. Speaker, a doctor in Cape Breton named Catherine McGuinness wrote to all Nova Scotia to express her concerns with the Liberal government's contract dispute with Nova Scotian doctors. And I'll table that article, Mr. Speaker. In the op-ed, Dr. McGuinness said she's having a baby in December, and like many other female physicians in Nova Scotia, she is counting on Doctors Nova Scotia's parental leave program to pay her secretary and her office expenses while she's on leave. Up until recently, doctors had a fund to protect from any changes the government might make to benefit funding, but after the government failed to make payments twice, the funds have been depleted. So my question to the minister is, what is the health minister going to do to ensure female physicians in Nova Scotia are able to take maternity leave now that they are disputing with Doctors Nova Scotia over the protection fund that many female physicians rely upon?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for raising this question. I think it's an important question to be brought to the floor of the House, Mr. Speaker, to clarify on behalf, and I hope the member takes it back to the individual who raised this concern through an op-ed or letter to the editor, that, Mr. Speaker, throughout the process, the requirements of what benefits the province of Nova Scotia, I believe it works out to about $600,000 per year, per month that goes toward from the province of Nova Scotia to Doctors Nova Scotia to cover our share as defined in the Master Agreement. We continue to make those payments, Mr. Speaker. At no point, Mr. Speaker, of those benefits for...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, did the benefits programs for individual physicians throughout the province go unfunded? And indeed, Mr. Speaker, the money and our commitment to continue making those payments is ongoing. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, they stopped making payments to that fund twice and it was depleted, so there was no funds there available for those doctors at that time. Dr. McGuinness is a hematologist in an underserviced area of Cape Breton and says she can attest to the impact this will have on the healthcare services and doctor recruitment. Why would young doctors who have spent over a decade in school and are ready to settle down and start a family want to come to a province where you're on your own financially if you decide to have a child? And today, on the Day of the Person, I would hope that this government would at least recognize that women across the province deserve to have access to maternity leave. So my question to the minister, will the minister commit to finding a solution for doctors like Dr. McGuinness so female physicians in our province are able to keep their offices afloat while they are on maternity leave?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'll reiterate to the member and to all members in the Legislature, and I hope they'll take the message back to the physicians within their communities, Mr. Speaker. The province remains committed to fulfill its obligation to make payments, our portion of those payments to Doctors Nova Scotia to ensure that those benefits get paid. Mr. Speaker, if there's a physician in this province who's concerned about whether or not their benefits will be paid, Mr. Speaker, I think that concern would be with Doctors Nova Scotia, because we remain committed. We'll continue to make our payments, Mr. Speaker, as invoiced as per the Master Agreement criteria, Mr. Speaker. So we continue to do that, Mr. Speaker. We commit to continue doing that, just like we do with the Nurses Union, Mr. Speaker, the Teachers Union, Mr. Speaker, with the Nova Scotia Governor, the NSGEU, Mr. Speaker, and all other collective bodies that we have an obligation to pay these benefits for. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to hear the minister tell us that they did not deplete that fund by stopping payments twice. Twice, Mr. Speaker, they stopped those payments, and I'd like to hear the Speaker tell us again that they didn't do that and that fund wasn't depleted.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.